Stephen R. Ward is a senior CIA intelligence analyst who specializes in Iran and the Middle East. He is a retired U.S. Army Reserve Lieutenant Colonel. He's very young. Yeah. From 2005 to 2006, he served as the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East on the National Intelligence Council, and he served on the National Security Council from 1998 to 1999. Mr. Ward has served in various analytic, managerial, and policy positions covering Near East and South Asian security and intelligence issues during 23 years at the CIA. His particular service has been on Iraqi, Iranian, and Afghani commissions and issues. He was twice awarded the Central Intelligence Agency Commendation Medal for his performance during the 1990-91 Gulf War and Operation Enduring Freedom in 2001-2002. His degrees are from the United States Military Academy at West Point, the University of Southern California, and, happy to say, he received an MA in National Security Studies from Georgetown's National Security Studies program in 1992. His article, The Continuing Evolution of Iran's Military Doctrine, was published in the Middle East Journal in 2005.
Thank you for that too kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. I'm pleasantly surprised by the size of the crowd, and I appreciate it very much. Also want to thank Mark Jacobs and the Library Associates for hosting tonight's event. With regard to the disclaimer, I will say this. I'm going to try and be as forthcoming as I possibly can when we get to the question and answer session, but just I do like to warn people in advance that there are some things I just can't get into, and also like to tell people that as a serving agency officer, you should understand that everything I say tonight are my views and my views alone. They don't represent the positions of the Central Intelligence Agency or any element of the United States government. With that said, let me start. First of all, with a name like Library Associates, I assumed that this would be a literary crowd. And while I'm not as literary as I probably should be or would like to be, I did draw the main idea for tonight's talk from, appropriately enough, the Greek playwright Aeschylus's tragedy, The Persians. If you're familiar with the play, or if not familiar with the play, you know that it's about the aftermath of the failed invasion of Greece by the Persian Emperor Xerxes in 480 BC. And more importantly, it's about the consequences of pride and overconfidence. Now, you might recall that the Persian invasions was launched to avenge the Greek defeat of Xerxes' father, Darius the Great, on the plain of Marathon 10 years before. And at the time of Xerxes, Persia was the world's single superpower. Its domain stretched from the Mediterranean all the way to the Hindu Kush. And Xerxes, after more than 4 years of preparation, had put together the largest expeditionary force that had been seen in the world up to that time. However, Xerxes failed. He was defeated at the naval battle of Salamis, one of the most decisive naval victories in history, and the Persians were forced to retreat back to Asia, never to return. Or some people might say never to return so far. The play, The Ghost of Darius the Great, comes back, and he now warns the weakened Persian Empire against further foreign adventures. And one of the things that he tells them, or at least the playwright has the Ghost of Darius say, is this: "But you, whose age demands more temperate thoughts, with words of well-placed counsel teach his youth, to curb that pride which from the gods call down destruction on his head." In short, beware of hubris, because the consequences can be very severe. Now, having written a book on Iran's military history over nearly 3 millennia, I think Aeschylus may have been onto something. The Iranians regularly have lapses of temperate thoughts over the course of their history. Now, not that they're alone at that. A lot of countries suffer from that. But repeatedly over the centuries, Iran's various dynasties provoked losing wars with the Romans, the Mongols, the Russians, and the British. And usually these defeats occurred because of an arrogant refusal by the ruling dynasty to properly consider the true balance of power between themselves and their enemies. The Islamic Republic has not done much better in curbing that Persian pride. After Iran stopped Iraq's invasion in September of 1980, it refused repeated offers to end the war on favorable terms, thinking that ultimately it could prevail. At one point in early 1982, Moscow went to the Iranians And even though it was heeding a UN arms embargo at the time, told them, if you don't stop and end the war, we're going to resume our arms deliveries to Baghdad. Well, the Iranians weren't really impressed with that, so the clerical regime continued with their operations. They invaded parts of Iraq, or launched a counteroffensive into Iraq, and as a result, the war lasted 6 more years until the Iraqis finally, rearmed with Soviet weapons and a lot of money from their Arab friends, ultimately defeated the Iranians. In the middle of this war, in the 1980s, when Iran needed all the friends it could get, they basically embarked upon a policy of terrorism and sedition that left them virtually isolated in the region. And at the same time, you may recall, the U.S. Navy started escorting oil tankers in the Gulf. Iranians didn't back down. They started challenging U.S. warships, and the end result of that was diverting precious resources away from the war fronts with Iraq to the Persian Gulf, and ultimately resulted in battles that cost them the better part of what was left of their navy after the fall of the Shah. More recently, Iran, of course, has been involved in Lebanon, and Iraq, and Afghanistan, and the full consequences of these events have not yet played out. One of the common elements in this Islamic Republic's history and these periods of refusing to back down is the Revolutionary Guard. The Guard is Iran's preeminent military force, and increasingly it's a Praetorian Guard that's deeply enmeshed in Iran's government and all aspects of its economy and society. The Guard, which is also called the Pasdaran, is literally a source of the Islamic Republic's pride, and it's a wellspring of its confidence and sometimes its overconfidence. Because of this, and because of its influence on Iranian policies, the Guard deserves special attention today when thinking about Iran's behavior and its policies. There are 3 points that I hope you take away from this evening's talk. First, the Revolutionary Guard has been a theocratic regime's protector from the very beginning. And ignoring Iran's own constitution, it is heavily involved in Iran's politics and has a major say in who holds power in Tehran. Second, the Guard, as pointed out in a recent RAND study called The Rise of the Pasdaran, has managed to extend its influence into virtually every corner of Iranian life and society. This really isn't surprising, however. In writing about Iran's military history, particularly over the past century, you find that's a well-worn path for Iranian armed forces. And then finally, the Guard retains its revolutionary outlook, which is infused with religion, and it shapes Iran's more assertive and authoritarian policies at home and abroad. The Guard is, as Darius might have put it, a font of intemperate thoughts. So who are the Revolutionary Guard? At the start of the new Islamic Republic in 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini knew that he needed an organized armed forces to help establish the clerical regime's monopoly on power. It's important to remember that the revolution of 1979 didn't become Islamic, although it had Islamic elements during the process, until after the fact. At the time, it was an unprecedented mass participation in a revolt against the Shah's regime. You had not only Islamists, but you had leftists and other secular organizations who were trying to get rid of the Shah. It was only after the Shah left that Khomeini and the Islamic militants started to assert themselves and push the leftists out of the way. And that's what Khomeini did. He basically turned to Islamic militants who had formed themselves into local groups, usually around mosques, to enforce their vision of what Islamic law should be. At the time, some of them called themselves the Party of God, or Hezbollah. It's the first time we heard that term, at least in the modern era. Within Iran, they were more popularly known as the club wielders, because that's exactly what they did. Khomeini gathered these groups together, and from them formed the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is its formal name. It was from the beginning an armed forces that gave its first loyalty to Khomeini as supreme leader and to his principles. And only secondary did it give its loyalty or give any obedience to the new revolutionary government, which at the time still included some leftist and secular forces. The Guard quickly became a central pillar of the new clerical regime, and it did this by restoring order, by repressing ethnic rebellions that broke out across the country, and also by supporting efforts by the clerics to remove the secular groups from power. Now, this came at a cost of waning popular support for the nascent theocracy. They were saved, however, in September of 1980. At that time, Saddam Hussein, leading a Sunni-dominated Iraq, invaded what he thought was a weak and disorganized Shia Iran. And this was basically a godsend. I mean, you can see how Khomeini might actually view it as yet another divine gift in that he was able to rally the nation to him in order to defend against the Iraqis. And so a new government that was starting to be unpopular and was starting to develop more resistance, basically had people rally to it and sort of ignore the continuing slide into tyranny that was occurring in Iran. The war also played a major role in shaping the Guard, its standing in Iran, and more importantly, its outlook. Now, fortunately for Iran, when Iraq invaded, most Iraqi divisions were led by politically reliable but military incompetent generals. The invasion quickly bogged down, and particularly in the face of stiff resistance from the Revolutionary Guard units that quickly went to the front, and also from the scattered remains of Iran's regular army. Millions of Iranians rallied to defense of their country, and from these people, Khomeini created the Basij, or the mobilization of the oppressed. And this was a popular militia that was created to basically be the reserve units for the Revolutionary Guard. And they would be, usually after the agricultural season, they'd be called up to round out Guard units for the inevitable late winter offensives that were conducted against Iraq. The Guard's response to the Iraqi invasion and to the myriad problems from the collapse of the Shah's military, or one of the major responses, was to promote a new Islamic way of war, what they called a new Islamic way of war, based on faith and spirituality. Now, given the bleak circumstances at the time, this probably wasn't a bad approach to give the Iranians a little something extra to maintain their morale. At the time of the invasion, the Iranians had lost roughly half of their regular armed forces to desertions, purges, and other factors, even though, as I mentioned, many of them returned to the colors once the Iraqis invaded. In the year before the war, the clerics were so busy basically trying to put their stamp on the army and ensure its political reliability that they didn't have time to look at readiness issues or supply problems, and they didn't. The result was, even though the Shah had left Iran with multitudes of warehouses stuffed to the ceiling with war material that he had bought, the Iranians at the time had serious logistic problems trying to move any of this stuff to the front. So they ran short of everything: ammunition, trucks, communications. They even ran short of food in the early periods. But they persevered and they prevailed. And again, in my book, one of the things that really stands out throughout Iran's military history is just the fortitude of the average Iranian soldier over history. Is something that I at least came to admire about them. When the Guard started the war, it was still growing. It was not that large, around 50,000 men, and had very few organized units that were actually equipped for combat or had any training for combat. So they really did go into this war as amateurs. But the war initiated a rapid expansion, and it very quickly grew to 100,000 and then 200,000, and when it called up the Basij forces, it was even larger. Another thing that happened in this period was it catapulted a lot of 20-year-old Iranians into senior commands. You had brigade commanders, division commanders, even some of the heads of the Guard itself were men in their late 20s and early 30s. And 30 years later, some of these officers are still running the organization. Stopping Saddam's army solidified the Guard's revolutionary outlook. Having adopted Khomeini's emphasis on jihad and martyrdom, it counted on revolutionary zeal to prevail whenever it went out on the battlefield. Now, in looking at it objectively, you see that Iran's successes had a lot more to do with the melding of the Guard's motivated personnel and inexperienced manpower with the regular military's planning, firepower, and logistics support. The masses of Basij, drawn from the rural and urban poor, joined the Guard's growing ranks, but it was only when they were backed by the Army's tanks and artilleries and the Air Force, and using a mix of clever infiltration tactics and some not-so-clever human wave assaults, it was only in those situations that the Guard-led Iranian forces were able to liberate all of Iraqi-held territory in Iran by mid-1982. Unfortunately for Iran, Khomeini and his lieutenants were flush with expectations of another divine victory, so they insisted on continuing the war even though the Iraqis regularly were offering them ceasefire and did so on terms that basically restored the status quo. The other thing that came out of this that was bad for Iran was the Guard's belief that its new Islamic way of war was working, and even though its tactics were being revealed increasingly as being very unsound. To Iran's chagrin, once it moved the war into Iraq, the Iraqis proved a lot more competent and determined in defending their own homeland. Over the next 6 years, Iran's major efforts to break Iraq's defensives were all costly failures. As one observer put it, Iran's basic strategy was roughly equivalent to try to break an anvil with a hammer. Iran's soldiers still made enough gains in each offensive to convince the more zealous Guard leaders that one more major offensive, one more try with maybe a slight tweak to tactics or maybe just a little better luck on the battlefield was all they needed to have that decisive victory over Iraq. They turned a blind eye to the cost of their Islamic way of war, and they continued to apply it even as Iran was bled of experienced combat leaders, as morale and hard-to-place equipment withered away. By the start of 1988, the years of massive losses of men and equipment and the disastrous effect of the war on Iran's economy had sapped most Iranians' desire to continue to sacrifice for the sake of getting rid of Saddam. And finally, when the end came, the Iraqis, in a series of very rapid offensives, basically devastated the Iranian military and forced the Guard to go to Khomeini and ask him to end the war. Now, the end result, as you're aware, was basically a return to the status quo, and that gave the Guard just enough daylight to basically claim that they win. As a matter of fact, I guess I should have began by saying the invasion was on September 22nd, so we're on the anniversary of the Iraqi invasion, and this is Holy Defense Week in Iran, and so even today they had a big parade to celebrate the fact that they won the Iran-Iraq War. Now, objectively, you look at it and say, no, you didn't, you lost. And the Guard's encouragement of the clerics overreaching and their lack of strategic foresight in expanding the war into Iraq in 1983 contributed to a massive waste of Iranian lives and resources. It destroyed their economy, and it basically denied them the chance to accept better terms before 1988. But the Guard looks at it as if they can and do say that the revolution survived. We accomplished our mission. So they take pride in, or at least justify their wartime actions, because while virtually isolated and relying almost totally on its own resources, Iran held out for years against a regional military power that was backed by generous Arab allies and both Cold War superpowers. The Guard's experience in the war has shaped its current military structure and its national security outlook. America's demonstrated prowess in conventional military operations in the years since the Iran-Iraq War, meanwhile, has led to an emergence of the Guard's reliance on religious zeal, irregular warfare, and militias in their plans to defend the Islamic Republic. At the same time, over the past 20 years, the Guard has also started to focus on deterrence strategies. So the Guard controls Iran's missiles. The Guard controls Iran's external operations forces. The Guard controls the naval forces that basically are responsible for defending the Gulf, and more importantly, are responsible for threatening all the energy flows that go through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, following the fall of Baghdad to U.S. forces in April 2003, the Guard, along with the regular military, announced that they were indeed changing their training and organization to emphasize irregular and partisan warfare to defend the country. The Guard later described its new doctrine as a Mosaic Defense. And basically the way they describe it is dividing the country into a mosaic, little parts, and in each part, Guard members would fight, in effect, guerrilla warfare using more modern technology, in effect, emulating tactics that they have supported and tried out in Iraq against coalition forces. As a matter of fact, following the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon in 2006, the Guard commanders went out and basically said, see that? They were following the Mosaic Defense doctrine. And that's how effective it is. Since taking charge in late 2003, the current Guard commander, Ali Jafari, has stated that what he thinks his service needs more than anything is to revive the fervor that they had during the Iran-Iraq War. And he thinks that the Guard needs to emphasize the human and spiritual factors over the material. So again, you kind of see that mindset that they take going into their concept of defense. I think I'll stop there with that part. Let me go over and talk a little bit about some other things, in particular the Guard's role in Iranian politics. As I mentioned, from its inception, the Guard has been a big political force in Iran. It was involved in the early regime infighting, and it occasionally confronts political divisions within its own ranks. Its main mission, and they do really believe in this, is to defend the purity of the Islamic Revolution, and this is enshrined in Iran's constitution as their main goal. And the Guard and the besieged view this as authority for varying degrees of both overt and covert political participation. As a matter of fact, Guard leaders from the start considered themselves free from civilian political authority other than the supreme leader. And they showed that in a number of ways. They consistently fought against attempts by the non-clerical elements of the government, including the elected elements of the government, to ever try and control them. Now, Khomeini, who was no fool, he saw from the beginning that having a strong armed revolutionary organization in your midst is something that's going to require some checks and balances, even if it's fully supported clerical rule. So one of the first things he did was he made himself commander-in-chief of the military, and particularly over the Guard, and had them basically swear their loyalty to him. He made sure that Guard leaders were, and they still are, chosen based on not how good a military officer they are, but just how loyal they are to the supreme leader, and basically how religious they are. They even assigned clerical commissars, called the Supreme Leader's Representatives, to all levels of the Guard, down basically to the platoon level, and they're there conducting religious indoctrination every day. Interestingly, two of the very first, or two of today's most prominent Iranian leaders, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, were Khomeini's first representatives to the Revolutionary Guard, and they seem to have done pretty well from that position. As I mentioned, the Guard quickly internalized Khomeini's Islamic ideology as a basic precept for organizing itself. In particular, this loyalty to the concept of Valayat-e-Faqih, which is the whole concept of rule by a Islamic jurisprudent or Islamic cleric, and that is what the current Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, uses and works very hard to keep that bond between the Guard and his office strong. Again, the fact that he gets to select who are the senior leaders and he gets to vet them helps strengthen that bond. As a result, the Guard's power and role in politics has grown steadily since the end of the Iran-Iraq War. Guard leaders have viewed it as their duty to intervene in politics when needed to protect the Islamic system, and sometimes they do it just to protect their own corporate interest. For example, embracing their role as Praetorians, the Guard helped suppress major protests in 1992, 94, and 99. Between 2002 and 2004, and this was a period when President Mohammad Khatami was at least the elected leader of Iran and was trying to reform the country, basically the Guard arranged to have its officers gain a significant share of seats in the elected legislature, the Majlis, and they did that as a way to block efforts by Khatami to reform or at least relax some of Iran's authoritarian nature. In 2005, the Guard and Besiege were denounced by reformist politicians for interfering in the presidential elections then and for helping elect President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And of course, as you're all aware, this past summer, the Guard, Besiege, and other security forces that are under the Guard's command now suppressed the reformist efforts to try and overturn Ahmadinejad's tainted re-election victory. The Guard's reward for its support to the conservative hardliners dominating Iran's government now has been to have their officers made governors, ministers, and diplomats. This has greatly added to the Guard's existing clout, which had always flowed from its role as the regime's protector, its internal security mission, the fact that it has its own domestic intelligence service, and that it controls its own political prisons. The Guard, as detailed in the Rand report I mentioned earlier, also is very active in spreading its ideology through the Besiege and its involvement in Iran's education system and in various cultural and media outlets. So, talk a little bit about the economy, and I don't want to say too much about that, but you know, one of the rewards of being a powerful political force in Iran is you get involved in business and trade, and you can get quite wealthy doing it. The Guard was able to do this in part because it parlayed its early involvement in military-related engineering and in the defense industries into a significant role in, as I mentioned, just about any field you can think of business, manufacturing, or public works. The Revolutionary Guard are there. The Guard's involvement in the economy ranges from smuggling illicit goods to running airport concessions. They build roads and dams, and I read where they even provide laser eye surgery to Iranians who need it. As I mentioned at the beginning, though, this is an old story. Going back to the 1800s, the Qajar dynasty just had a terrible reputation, or its military had a terrible reputation for corruption. Iran's senior officer under Reza Shah, who was the first Pahlavi ruler from 1925 to 1941, they were notorious for acquiring fortunes through shady business and real estate deals, and then once they got a certain amount of money, they would marry into the old Qajar elite to increase their fortunes and basically secure their standing in society. The last Shah, he followed his father's practice of basically purchasing a senior officer's loyalty by, again, allowing them to run provinces, giving them ministerial and diplomatic assignments, allowing them to run industries, all of which provided lots of opportunities for graft and corruption and the opportunities to build fortunes. In this regard, the Pasdaran, ironically, are really the true heirs to the last Shah's armed forces. More so than the Iranian regular forces today, the Guard follows that role of being loyal to the leader, supporting the leader, and being rewarded greatly economically for that support. The Guard, however, I think appears even more involved in the economy and probably is more corrupt than the imperial armed forces ever were. The other major difference is that the Pahlavi Shahs used the military's involvement in the economy as a means of political control. Again, they used it to ensure that the commanders remained loyal and subservient. In contrast, increasingly what we see in Iran today is that the Guard's involvement makes it more powerful. It's more of a political player, and it's actually less beholden to the supreme leader, the president, and other elites because of its power. It also gives the Guard interest, as the Rand report outlines, that could make it a strong policy advocate, particularly in things like openings to the West, where because they benefit greatly from having a monopoly inside the country, from actually benefiting from sanctions because they provide illicit goods at higher prices, they are a voice in some cases against freer trade and economic interaction with the world. So let me conclude and leave some time for some questions. As the Islamic Republic of Iran enters its fourth decade, I think the Guard actually can take a full measure of credit for performing its role as the regime's protector. It seems certain that the Guard will continue to play a significant role in its country's future and fortunes. This is particularly true as Iran's conservative elite have become increasingly composed of second-generation hardliners, many of whose formative experiences were as Guard officers in the Iran-Iraq War. For example, Iranian President Ahmadinejad, who, again, as I've discussed, was reelected this past summer as a former Guard officer. His recently appointed Interior Minister, who is responsible for running elections, among other things, is Mustafa Mohammad Najjar. He's another Guard veteran, and is actually one of the people who helped establish Hezbollah in Lebanon. The new defense minister, just approved this month, is a guy named Ahmad Vahidi. He's the former commander of the Quds Force, the external operations arm I mentioned that supports Hezbollah and other anti-U.S. and anti-Israeli groups around the world. He also is wanted by the Argentinians for being in command of the Quds Force when the Quds Force and Hezbollah were responsible for a bombing in Argentina in 1994 against the Argentine-Israeli Mutual Aid Association. I got that correctly. So again, not exactly a good group of characters. It's important to note before closing, though, that the Guard, while generally unified, is not monolithic. Some of the Guard's former senior officers opposed Ahmadinejad's policies and elections. Some retired officers came out in support of former Prime Minister Mousavi. The first Guard commander, a guy named Mohsen Rezai, actually ran against Ahmadinejad in this past June election. The current Guard commander, who I mentioned, Muhammad Ali Jafari, has expressed concerns about the commitment of the Guard's rank and file. One of the first things he did after becoming Guard commander was he announced that he was setting up a program to improve its revolutionary spirit. Again, as if they didn't have enough indoctrination, Jafari came in and said, we're going to give you a little bit more until you get that good old-time revolutionary spirit going. The Majlis, which I mentioned, has been stacked with a lot of former Guard officers. Gave Ahmadinejad an incredibly hard time in his first administration. They impeached several of his ministers. They voted against a lot of his programs. So, clearly not everybody's on board with the project. And as the Rand study points out, and as I mentioned earlier, the Guard's economic interest does carry the potential for some dilution of its cohesion. While there are those who benefit from sanctions and would be against more open trade with the West or, the end of sanctions, there are clearly a lot of pragmatic Guard officers and people involved in the economy who would welcome that and understand the benefits of freer trade. So for now, Iran's leaders, strongly influenced by the Guard, appear to be taking the country in a more nationalistic and possibly more militaristic direction. At a minimum, because the new leaders are closer to the revolutionary form of Shia Islam preached by Ayatollah Khomeini, they are likely to be even more assertive in challenging the current U.S.-dominated status quo in the region. Looking at Iran over the coming years, it's fair to wonder if the Iranians might once again be getting caught up in their legacies of national pride, and the conviction that we've seen in the past that their cause, in this case their revolutionary Islamic movement, must ultimately prevail. Anthony Cordesman of the Center of Strategic and International Studies regularly reviews Iran's military capabilities and assesses the threat they pose to the region. Frankly, I trust him. He points out that Iran is not a weakling militarily, but also points out that it's not really capable of succeeding in any major act of offensive military operations outside its borders. Given this objective view of the state of Iran's armed forces, hopefully the Iranians are aware of the risk of some of their current and potential policies hold in provoking the West's military might, and as Darius's ghost warned, calling down destruction on their heads. If not, then I think the likelihood will be much greater that Iran's leaders will succumb to the temptation to risk conflict by overreaching in their strategic goals. And if they do, I think this will confirm to us that the ghost that's haunting Iran right now is that of Khomeini and not that of Darius. And with that, I will thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take some questions about the Guard or any other aspects of Iran's military history.